And good afternoon. You're listening to Ken Hudnall. This is the Ken Hudnall Show. Coming to you from our studios right here in exciting El Paso, Texas. Gateway to the Old West and the most haunted city in the country. Well, today's June the 15th, 166th day of this year. Just 199 days remain to the year's over with, and we'll start a new one. It's Global Wind Day, National Smile Power Day dedicated to spreading joy through the simple, contagious power of a smile. Nature Photography Day. On this day in 1215, King John of England fixed his royal seal to the Magna Carta at Runnymede, which laid the foundation for a modern constitutional law. And, of course, in 1836, Arkansas was officially admitted to the Union as the 25th state. And if you've never spent time in Arkansas, it's a unique location. A lot of unusual people can be found in Arkansas. Well, on that date, let's see what stories we have in the news. President Trump announced that a deal had been completed with Iran. An Iranian Security Council issued a statement after he made that announcement. The two countries agreed on a deal to end the war, which had a effect on oil prices, set them low. The two countries came to an agreement to reopen the Strait of Hormuz and cease hostilities as they launched further negotiations today. Vice President Vance declared the agreement will change the Middle East if Iran complies with its end of the deal. Israeli leaders criticized the deal, though Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu is yet to comment on it. And Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz said IDF forces will not be withdrawing from Lebanon despite the deal between the U.S. and Iran. But the Iranian Security Council confirmed the U.S.-Iran deal has been finalized, bringing an immediate end to the war in effect. So we'll see if Iran keeps its agreement. Well, singer Oliver Tree, presumed dead after his helicopter was involved in a collision in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. He was an American singer and record producer, 32 years old, presumed dead after a tragic helicopter collision. He was a California native, reportedly among 6 people killed when 2 helicopters collided in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil on Sunday morning. That's according to the Associated Press. Rio de Janeiro Military Fire Department said one of the helicopters crashed on a car dealership where several electric vehicles were parked, igniting a fire that was shortly extinguished. An investigation is underway to determine the cause of the collision. Representatives for Tree didn't immediately respond to the Fox News request for comment. He recently performed in Sao Paulo, Brazil on June 6th as part of his world tour in support of his latest album, Love You Madly, Hate You Badly. He had scheduled to play his next show in Lisbon, July 1st. Well, if you've never spent any time in South America, a lot of that continent is covered with jungle, and it's very, very difficult to get a complete story quickly in that particular environment. Well, Tom Brady and Bridget Monahan posed together at their son Jack's graduation. He graduated from high school, and Brady reunited with his ex-girlfriend Monahan to attend their son's graduation. Former athlete and the actress shared pictures on their Instagram pages on his big day. Brady posted a carousel of images, with one featuring himself posing with Jack and Monahan. He also penned a heartfelt, lengthy note about his son in support of the Instagram carousel. He wrote, "One of the proudest days of my life, watching Jack walk across the stage and graduate into the next chapter of life, already an impressive life. You're an amazing son, brother, grandson, nephew, and friend, among many other things. What makes me happiest is knowing who you are when no one else is watching. The way you show up for your friends, the way you check on people having a hard day, the love you give our family, and the fact that you still let me win every 101, at least every once in a while." Well, Scottish fan is a priceless reaction after seeing New England Patriots cheerleaders at the World Cup game. There's been one theme of the 2026 FIFA World Cup so far. It's been visitors from foreign nations discovering just how awesome America is and can be. From German dudes discovering Waffle House in the Deep South to Japanese fans experiencing chips and salsa overload in Texas, it's been absolutely beautiful seeing the guests of this nation being exposed to the best parts of our culture stateside. One country citizens have been particularly enjoyable time in the U.S. has been Scotland. But the moment they got off the plane, droves of Scots have been taking in the sights and sounds of America. We all know about the Scottish tourist who made his pilgrimage to the mecca of gas stations, Buc-ee's, as well as Airbnb bagpipe brigade. But a fellow Scotsman got the ultimate taste of freedom after he'd already set foot in the stadium to watch his beloved nation start their quest for a World Cup. Well, he was mesmerized by what he saw, but had nothing to do with anything happening on the pitch. He was overwhelmed with the cheerleaders, which can happen, quite frankly. Well, The Office star blasts political hypocrisy, explaining why sitcoms couldn't be made today. Rainn Wilson, best known for playing Dwight Schrute in the hit sitcom The Office, says partisan hypocrisy on both sides of the political aisle is fueling American divisions, arguing that cancel culture's stifled modern-day comedy. He told Fox News that cancel culture, result of growing political divisions, has damaged the ability of a comedy and a show like The Office to thrive and be accepted in today's society. And there's a lot of shows that could never have been made today as they were at the time they were made. He said, "I do feel you couldn't make The Office today. I think that would be too hard to be as politically incorrect as the show was, and do kind of miss that," he said. He explained how, despite that both his character and actor Steve Carell's role as Michael Scott were purposely portrayed as lacking self-awareness and a boob, the humor still wouldn't fly or be viewed as socially acceptable in today's society. And certainly there's a lot to be said for that. Well, the mystery of some remains found inside a sleeping bag in Olympic Park's been solved after 26 years. Human remains discovered in a remote section of a Washington State National Park more than 20 years ago have finally been identified, bringing long-awaited answers about that person's identity. National Park Service officials announced that the remains found in the Olympic National Park belonged to Joseph Louis Serrao, Jr., a Hawaii native whose family last had contact with him in 1998. And this case remained unresolved for nearly 30 years, but investigators never lost sight of the goal of identifying this individual, finding answers for his family. According to Deborah Flowers, Deputy Chief of the National Park Service Investigative Services Branch. And she said, "I'm proud of the persistence, collaboration that made this identification possible. Hope it brings some measure of closure to those who've spent so many years wondering what happened to Joseph." And it's easy, if you've never spent time in some of these parks, for something like this to happen. Well, let's see. Deborah Henry and Leighton Abramovic get emotional watching Fox co-worker Alexa Lalas react to the national anthem. You know, a few things can bring out a sense of national pride, kind of like an international sports tournament. With the 2026 FIFA World Cup taking place on U.S. soil, every American, or at least the ones proud of their heritage, is experiencing a renewed sense of love for their country. And then again, it's even easier to be proud of where you're from when you've foreign visitors heaping praise on your homeland in droves. One patriotic American who doesn't need a reminder that his country is awesome is Fox Sports soccer analyst Alexa Lalas. He donned the Stars and Stripes for the United States during the 1994 World Cup, which took place in America. Never been shy about wearing his pride for the states on his sleeve. No one was happy to see the U.S. men's national team dismantle Paraguay to open the group's stages of this year's World Cup than Lalas, but his pride wasn't just contained in the happenings on the pitch. During the singing in the national anthem before Friday's match, he got very emotional and was moved to tears. And if you've never been to any of these events, certainly it's can easily happen. Well, some Detroit sisters were accused of stabbing a restaurant worker after their food order was screwed up. Two Detroit sisters, including one who was 9 months pregnant at the time, are accused of stabbing a worker at a Detroit chicken restaurant during a wrong order dispute, with prosecutors alleging one sister stabbed the employee and then the woman attempted to throw hot grease and pans and other items at her. Brianna and Kariana Long now face several charges in connection with the May 30th incident, including assault with intent to murder, assault with intent to do great bodily harm, less than murder, and assault with a dangerous weapon, according to local reports. Both women, of course, pled not guilty. Two sisters entered the restaurant, ran behind the counter, and attacked the 23-year-old employee after they were given a wrong order, according to prosecutors. Sisters threw items at the employee, chased her through the restaurant, hit her with pots and pans, attempted to throw hot grease on her head, and threatened to kill her, according to prosecutors. One of the sisters allegedly screamed, "I'm going to kill you," during the encounter. And the employee was then stabbed in the stomach with a knife by Kariana, according to prosecutors. The injured employee had to be taken to the hospital for surgery after she ran out of the restaurant and hid inside a stranger's vehicle while calling for help. Brianna, 29, and Kariana, 26, fled the scene after the attack but were eventually arrested by police. Defense attorneys attempted to dispute the allegations in court, arguing the employee triggered the assault by saying she didn't give an F about the food order error before throwing items, including knives, first during the incident. Well, what folks seem to forget is almost every place you go, there are cameras. So what actually happened was seen. Well, Boston police arrested a 14-year-old after a masked suspect allegedly robbed a sibling's lemonade stand. Now, that is a real vicious criminal to rob a kid's lemonade stand. 14-year-old suspect's been arrested in connection with an armed robbery last week that targeted a children's lemonade stand in South Boston, according to authorities. Robbery happened Wednesday afternoon near West 9th Street when two suspects allegedly approached two children operating the stand, stole their cash box, and pulled a firearm during the incident. Officials said the arrested suspect is facing multiple firearm-related charges, including 2 counts of armed robbery and 2 counts of unlawful possession of a firearm. The second suspect remains at large. The suspects allegedly targeted a lemonade stand run by an 11-year-old girl and a 12-year-old brother, according to CBS Boston. Boston Police Department said the pair made several passes by the stand before approaching and asking whether Apple Pay was accepted. Before the children could respond, the suspects grabbed the cash box with one flashing a black firearm tucked into his waistband. Boston Herald reported the suspects allegedly stole about $50 from the cash box. Well, it takes all kinds to make a world. 11 skydivers and a pilot were killed in Missouri plane crash near the airport. Missouri authorities announced Sunday that 12 people were killed in a plane crash in a mass casualty event that left everybody on board dead. Sources told Fox News Kansas City 11 of the victims were skydivers and the 12th was the pilot. Crash happened near Butler Memorial Airport about 65 miles south of Kansas City, according to a statement from the Missouri State Highway Patrol. Plane was engulfed in flames after the crash, but emergency responders were able to extinguish the fire shortly after the impact, according to Bates County Sheriff Chad Anderson. Pacific Aerospace P-750 crashed while departing from Butler Memorial Airport in Missouri about 11:35 in the morning, local time on Sunday, according to the FAA. Air traffic services were not being provided at the time. 12 people are on board. The FAA, National Transportation Safety Board, will investigate. The incident happened when a private plane departing the airport turned around for an unknown reason and crashed near Business 49 Highway. Dennis Jacobs, acting airport manager and director of the Bates County Emergency Management Agency, told the Associated Press he suspects the aircraft experienced power issues before the crash. He said it had just taken off, made a left turn. In my opinion, I think it was losing power and he's trying to make it over the highway and land, but he stalled and went down nose first and caught fire. Well, let's see what else we got. Well, President Trump marked his 80th birthday with a patriotic UFC Freedom 250 spectacle on White House South Lawn. President Trump marked his 80th birthday Sunday with a celebration on the South Lawn where 14 fighters from around the world battered one another inside a wire mesh cage during the UFC Freedom 250 spectacle. He walked out of the Oval Office about 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time alongside the UFC CEO and President Dana White. What was best described as a fighter's walkout. The estimated 4,300 in attendance, which included about 1,200 active duty service members, greeted the president with cheers as the occasional happy birthday was shouted from the crowd. The event kicked off with the Marine Band's performance of the national anthem sung by Zach Brown, was capped off with a flyover by the Navy's Blue Angels and the Air Force Thunderbirds. Beyond anything anybody had ever seen in sports, according to the president, briefly remarked during his remarks to reporters as he departed the White House ahead of Monday's G7 summit in France. As expected, the crowd often broke out into USA chants multiple times throughout the evening, most often heard during American Justin Gaethje's thrilling main card winner with the previously undefeated Ilia Topuria. Yes, President Trump has brought a unique perspective to the White House, let me tell you. Well, Vice President J.D. Vance is going to appear on The View after the host had condemned him for years. After years of blasting Vice President J.D. Vance, they're going to host him on their show. And Vance, who is set to join the show June 16th, will be the third sitting vice president to appear on The View. All six co-hosts, Whoopi, I Can't Keep My Mouth Shut Goldberg, Joy Behar, Sonny Hostin, Sarah Haynes, Alyssa Ferry Griffin, and Anna Navarro expected to be in the studio for this rare interview with an elected Republican. The View had a total of 341 guests in 2025, but only 2 of them were conservative. 128 were liberal, according to a study conducted by the Media Research Center's Newsbusters. And the host of the show have a long history of blasting both him and his wife since he became President Trump's running mate. I suspect there's going to be fireworks, no question about that. Well, President Trump bet the tariffs will bring back American factory jobs. A new report says it really didn't work that way. President Trump's Liberation Day tariffs promise is facing challenges from a new analysis that argues the sweeping trade policy failed to revive manufacturing and instead slowed job creation in the U.S. The report, obtained first by Fox News, lands a month after President Trump's signature economic policies were handed a blow and the Supreme Court struck down sweeping tariffs. Businesses are now seeking billions of dollars in tariff refunds. We will see how that all comes about. And there comes the peanut gallery tuning up. Well, in an interesting turn of events, Spencer Pratt unites with Karen Bassett's brother to sue the LA mayor over the Palisades fire destruction. Pratt has continued his fight to save Los Angeles only days after conceding in the mayoral race against incumbent Karen Bass. Pratt, who's 42, gave the public nod of approval to LA mayor's brother, Kenneth Bass, who last month sued the city, state, and additional agencies as part of a broader legal action filed after the deadly Palisades fire. He said, I'm paired to be teaming up with Karen Bass, his brother, and suing his sister for her reckless negligence that led to the destruction of everybody's homes. You know, the sad thing is, when Bass should have been paying attention to the people she was representing, she was off having a holiday. Well, we've got David Axelrod. Next Biden staffer blames Biden's hubris for the hellscape that we live in. The next Biden campaign staffer blamed the former president's decision to seek a second term for President Trump's return to the White House. And as the Biden family mounts a public effort to rehabilitate the Biden's political legacy, a lot of interesting statements are being made. According to the former campaign staffer, I think it's very hard to ever get over the fact he's responsible for the hellscape we live in now. And it's undeniable his hubris cost us. He's an extremely impactful president who was successful in delivering tangible wins for Americans, but all they got washed away. The sad thing is, there's a lot of folks who were there who said for most of his term, President Biden was really not aware of what was going on. A lot of things were done in his name that he knew nothing about. The report was published Friday, detailed Biden's June 5th appearance at the South Dakota Democratic Party's McGovern Day dinner in Sioux Falls, where the 83-year-old former president addressed roughly 1,200 Democrats at the Best Western near the airport. He used a speech to attack President Trump while telling the crowd he'd to leave early for his goddaughter's wedding. So when I run off the stage, it's not because I'm afraid to hear the response. I got other things to do. New York Magazine reported Biden spoke quietly, occasionally yelled, and at times lost his train of thought, but still received a warm response from the Democratic audience. Biden called Trump the most corrupt president in the history of the United States. You know, I've known President Trump since the early 90s, and all this talk of corruption, what have you, I didn't see any of it. Well, yesterday, I did my first book signing in a few years. San Elizario had its 150th anniversary when Billy the Kid broke some people out of the San Elizario jail. And they had quite an event. And we just came out with our 141st book. It can be found on Amazon.com under Kindle. Look up Ken Hudnall. And had about a dozen of them there. The big seller was our book about the border escapades of Billy the Kid. Interestingly enough, as is quite often the case, what history reports is not exactly true. According to the story, Pat Garrett shot Billy the Kid and killed him in a darkened bedroom in a gentleman's home. In actuality, and I got this story from Billy the Kid's grandson a number of years ago. Billy, of course, was a young man at the time. He was 21 or 22. And he had another guy in his gang who looked a lot like him. A lot of folks thought they were brothers. Pat Garrett, who was a good friend of Billy's, had been offered a $500 reward by the state legislature if he could end Billy's reign of terror. Well, Billy and his gang member walked into that dark bedroom. Billy said, Ken S., who is it? Because he heard somebody moving in the dark. And according to what the grandson told me, Pat Garrett shot the friend, hit Billy in the head, knocked him out, put his body under the bed, and pointed to the dead gang member and said, I just shot Billy. Well, nobody disputed it. Pat got his reward from the state legislature, and in those days, $500 was a considerable amount of money. And the gang member was buried as Billy. Billy, who had an illegitimate child with a young lady who worked on that particular ranch, took his child, his girlfriend, and left. And according to the grandson, Billy died many, many years later in Silver City, New Mexico. Well, I took all that information, researched it, and confirmed as much was true as I could, and came out with a book that has gotten some very good reviews, talking about the border escapades. Now, San Elizario, which is about, 35, 40 miles from where I'm sitting, has quite an interesting history. And even though it, at one point it was the county seat, but politics reared its ugly head, and El Paso became the county seat. The fascinating thing is, a lot of that history is really not talked about that much. And some of our best-selling books have actually been telling folks what the history didn't say. But yesterday was quite an interesting event. It started at noon, and then at 6 o'clock there was a play. Everybody got dressed up in their 1880s finery. It was a very enjoyable event. And this is the first book signing I've done in probably 5 years. We had they used to do them almost every weekend. Then we had COVID, and then health issues. But we're getting back into the swing of things. You know, interestingly enough, got into a discussion with a couple of folks, and we got to talking about secret government operations, and that's always good for a discussion. Now, very few people have ever heard about Operation Northwoods, which is best described as a false flag plot. Now, a false flag plot is when you destroy your own people or property and point to somebody else. And that's exactly what Operation Northwoods was. Now, it was designed by a group of very high-profile Americans. General Lyman Limnitzer was actually in charge of the group that came up with it. And he talked about the fact that the situation in Cuba had escalated. We failed with the exiles. We failed with the sugar embargo. We failed at the Bay. The president wants results. Well, the American people did not want a war at that point in time. And the problem the military had was figuring out how to get their country behind doing something about Cuba. So a 9-page document was prepared, stamped top secret, and the title was Operation Northwoods. The one comment made by Major General Edward Lansdale after he read the document was it called for the bombing of our own people. And certainly something like that can end a career. But Limnitzer had an answer. He said, we create the appearance of Cuban aggression, controlled incidents, Civilian panic, a crisis that justifies action. And somebody said, well, what if people die? And the response was, well, things happen. And according to the intelligence liaison, he said, well, if they die, they're going to die anyway if we don't do anything. Look at Khrushchev. Look at the missiles. Castro's not just a nuisance. He's a beachhead for the Soviets. If we don't act, we hand them the hemisphere. And that was always the fear. If we don't do something, the Russians win. And they had installed missiles in Cuba, 90 miles off our southern border. According to another general, and a lot of this came through whistleblowers, according to another general, it's not a question of optics. It's a matter of ethics. It's a question of optics. Make it look like they fired the first shot. We win at that point. Otherwise, we're chasing shadows. One of the other senior officials at the table said, but proposing false flag operations on American soil isn't just controversial, it's actually illegal. And Lemnitzer had a response for everything. He said, you think legality stops Moscow? You think morality keeps Castro awake at night? Well, it was March of 1962. Cuban Missile Crisis hadn't yet broke into the headlines. But the heat in the Pentagon had already risen beyond safe levels. And for the men in that room during that meeting, the Cold War wasn't a metaphor. It was a calculation, a ledger of deterrence, casualties, and probabilities. The Soviets had their famous chess. We had theater. Outside, the world ticked along in ignorance. American families ate dinner by the television. School children practiced duck and cover drills that nobody believed would save them. I do remember the training we got on what to do if there was a nuclear attack. We were all taught to get in doorways or dive under a desk, and we'd be walking down the hallway and somebody would scream, "Tuck and roll." And we had to go into all the gyrations. At Langley and Fort Meade, tapes were spooled and names recorded and agents deployed. But according to the whistleblowers, in that room, something else took root. A cult of certainty. They believed. They believed in order and supremacy and the righteousness of outcomes. Lemnitzer said, we have over a dozen options. Hijack our own planes, sink our own ships, orchestrated funerals, even considered faking the death of astronauts, he said. Nobody thought any of that was amusing. Now, in most of these meetings, stenographers took down everything that was said, but not in the meetings to do with Operation Northwoods. Well, according to one of the generals, they need a lot of civilian actors. And they had an answer for that. He said, nope, we just need real civilians. They were willing to sacrifice American citizens for what they considered the good of the country. One Air Force officers asked what they'd tell the press. And another one of the generals said, we don't. We'll let the American people do what they always do, believe what's in front of them. And 90% of the population, if it's written in the New York Times, that's the gospel. Well, they discussed simulated sabotage and mortality acceptability thresholds. A certain number of deaths were quite acceptable. These bureaucratic words certainly hit hard. One Navy official raised an objection. He said it's one thing to manipulate intelligence to influence the headlines, but it's quite another to bomb a bus. And one of the generals responded, well, we'd bomb it only if it's empty, preferably. And according to Lemnitzer, and he staked his career on this plan, the operation goes forward. We deliver Castro on a platter. Give the president what he's been too cautious to take. We secure the hemisphere for America. And if it leaks out, one of them asked, because every meeting I've ever been in, by the time it's over and we get back to our offices, everybody already knows what we talked about. It's amazing. Well, but nobody dared say at that meeting, not even out loud, was what they were all thinking. This wasn't just strategy. It was something else. It was a ritual, a bloodless invocation of violence for the promise of control. Not religion, not exactly, but the architecture belief was the same. Well, the first plan presented was elegant in its simplicity. Passenger plane would take off from Miami, scheduled to fly to Central America. And on paper, it'd be carrying college students, missionaries, ordinary Americans heading to volunteer projects abroad. In reality, that plane would be empty, except for a handful of government operatives disguised as civilians. Halfway through the flight, the plan was for the pilot to transmit a Mayday signal. He was supposed to claim Cuban fighters were tailing the aircraft, and then there'd be silence. The plane would vanish from radar, supposedly shot down in international waters. Meanwhile, the second identical plane, painted and numbered to match the first one, ran quietly to secure a military airstrip. The crew would disappear. Records never be found. And across the country, grief would bloom in front of flickering televisions, and mothers would cry, and flags would be lowered, and Cuba would be blamed. It was in actuality a ghost flight built for mourning. Another memo proposed detonating explosives inside a U.S. Navy vessel docked at Guantanamo Bay. The blast would occur during a training drill, ensuring the crew had plausible reason to be caught off guard. That explosion would kill a dozen servicemen, maybe more. Shrapnel, bodies, fire, just enough to spark television outrage. The proposed headline that would hit the newspapers shortly after the explosion: Cuban aggression strikes again. Another option detailed a fake terror campaign across major cities: Washington, D.C., Miami, even L.A. Agents would stage bombings in shopping malls and public squares using incendiary devices packed into trash cans and lockers. Injuries would be very real, so would the funerals. But the entire narrative would be fiction. Cuban operatives aided by the Soviets, striking at the heart of the free world. Somebody scrawled in the margins of the first page of that document, essential to maintain believable Cuban fingerprints. That phrase would echo through meeting after meeting like a refrain: believable fingerprints. Well, at Langley, which is CIA headquarters, a man named Arthur Mason, logistics officer on temporary assignment, had the task of coordinating all the resources. He once managed some of the food shipments to Berlin, but this was quite different. He led the requests that came across his desk: requests for untraceable firearms and forged IDs and blank passports, and realized without anybody saying it, these weren't hypotheticals. Ink wouldn't even dry before somebody asked for delivery schedules. He began waking up every morning at 3 a.m, sweating over what he was being asked to do. One morning he walked into a supervisor's office and said, "Are we really going to do this?" Well, according to a supervisor, we're preparing options. Nothing has been approved as of yet. But if you know anything about government, government works in a certain way. Options become policy with the stroke of a pen. What was drafted in the shadows is almost never erased. In D.C., the Joint Chiefs actually moved the operation forward. And each detail is refined with clinical detachment. If a civilian plane was hijacked, the agents would carry real passports. If a student protest was needed, actors would be hired from military theater divisions. If a martyr was required, a hero to die on live TV, there was a file of suitable candidates already waiting. They even considered blowing up John Glenn's rocket. Well, among the notes that were found later attached to a classified memo, that memo was titled Suggestions for Heightened Emotional Impact. The very first note said exploding a U.S. launch vehicle in flight, specifically referenced Glenn's mission, could galvanize support if attributed to external sabotage. That memo was unsigned. And as reprehensible as the idea was, nobody struck it down. Nobody removed it. Among those reviewing the documents was a Defense Department official named Ruth Bennett, one of the few civilians with a high enough clearance, brought in for her background in counterintelligence and psychological operations. She had read about propaganda in textbooks, taught the history of psychological warfare, but she was to later comment there was something darker. She started a proposal for staging a funeral with actors, complete with weeping widows and sobbing children. During a meeting, she said, "This is theater. We're scripting national grief." But the justification for all this was always the same. Castro was a threat. The Soviets were encroaching on our hemisphere. American people needed to be united in an effort to remove these threats. But unity, according to the planners, had a price. Some of the memos referenced expendable, fabricated, and acceptable losses. And these phrases started to appear more frequently in the writings. The language dulled the brutality of the intent, cloaked it in professionalism. But beneath the acronyms and buzzwords was a single inescapable truth. The government was planning to hurt its own people. Not by accident, not by negligence, but by design and actuality. At one point, somebody proposed creating a fake martyr within the military. A well-liked Hispanic officer with a made-up Cuban cousin who could be connected to the attack. Personal histories were even written. Photographs were selected. The family was invented. He didn't exist, but his funeral was already being storyboarded. And if you're not familiar with a storyboard, that's how directors and producers outline a movie. They create storyboards. And every movement in that film is scripted. By early April, the plan was assembled into a formal presentation for presidential review, and it was a thick dossier. Separate envelope containing suggested media angles, complete with draft newspaper headlines, tailored statements for cabinet members, and outlines for a televised speech from the Oval Office. And the final page of that proposal to the president was signed by every member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And at the very bottom, in blue ink so it stood out from the rest, was General Lemnitzer's mark. He put his full support behind this plan. When the envelope was sealed It was arranged to be directly delivered to the West Wing. Now, at this point, nobody said it out loud, but some had begun to realize they'd crossed a line. Not with the plan itself, but with their willingness to normalize it. They weren't just plotting a deception. They were redefining the nation as a whole. It was April of 1962 when the president opened that folder. The Oval Office was quiet except for the click of a clock on the mantelpiece. Through the windows came a pale morning light, softening the sharp lines of the document he held in his hands. His advisors sat nearby, each waiting for a flicker reaction on his face. But John Kennedy was a hard man to read. He turned each page, read them slowly. When he finally looked up, those who were present described his voice as cold, measured. He said, "Who the hell thought this was acceptable?" And George Bundy, one of his closest advisors, later said he, at that point, didn't really want to be in the room, was the one that responded. He said it came from the Joint Chiefs, General Lemnitzer's team. Kennedy dropped the folder on the desk and said, "You're telling me the highest-ranking officers in the United States military sat around a table and suggested we fake terrorist attacks on our own soil, bomb buses, hijack planes, and murder our own people and blame it on Cuba?" Well, Bundy responded, "Mr. President, the proposal states that," and Kennedy stopped him. He said, "I read all of it, and I want to know if any of you actually considered bringing this to me as a viable option." Well, at that point, nobody responded. Kennedy stood up and got ready to leave the room, and he said, "This is not who we are. And you tell Lemnitzer this plan dies here." The rejection was immediate, unambiguous, irreversible. Well, when Lemnitzer was informed, he didn't shout a protest. He nodded, folded his briefing paper, and walked out of the office. That was his last term as chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Kennedy replaced him just a few months later. Operation Northwoods was buried in a classified vault at the Pentagon, sealed away under the pretext of national security. And it remained hidden for almost 40 years. But the problem is, the idea didn't go away. The idea lingered, not in execution, but in possibility. The men who authored that plan returned to their duties. Some were reassigned, others retired, with honor, of course. Nobody was prosecuted. Nobody apologized. In their minds, they had simply done what was necessary, designed scenarios to provoke a reluctant public into war. They saw it not as treason, but as strategy. And that, unfortunately, made it even worse. In 1997, journalist James Bamford filed a request under the Freedom of Information Act. And among thousands of released papers that he received, there was a 9-page document stamped top secret. And it outlined a government plan to stage false flag attacks against Americans in order to justify war with Cuba. What had been rumored now turned out to be true. Operation Northwoods was quite truthfully a proposal from the Joint Chiefs to kill American citizens. And the American public was stunned. Some refused to believe it, others saw it as validation of every suspicion they ever had about the government. Conspiracy theorists clutched the document like scripture. Political commentators reeled. Senators demanded explanations. Unfortunately, the architects were long gone. The answers arrived in whispers, if they arrived at all. And of course, nobody was punished. That's not how the game is played in Washington. Because it had never actually been carried out, no crime had technically been committed. But the damage wasn't in execution, it was in revelation. Northwoods confirmed that the unimaginable had been imagined. Behind the suits and symbols of national power were men willing to orchestrate death and fear and deception for the sake of policy. The document became a kind of artifact, a skeleton key for the paranoid, a case study for historians, a warning for the idealistic. Well, in the years that followed, references to Northwoods surfaced whenever tragedy struck. When a plane went down, when a building collapsed, when war began, somebody always asked the question, was it real or was it scripted? Didn't matter if the plane was killed. The fact it was ever written down was enough to cause issues. And inside intelligence circles, the name Northwoods became shorthand for a line that should never be crossed. But others weren't so sure. In private think tanks and closed meetings and black budget corridors, ideas like that were still whispered. Always with plausible deniability, always with patriotic framing. They didn't call it evil. Oh no, it was contingency. Well, today the phrase false flag carries the weight of 1,000 conspiracy theories. It's become a poison term used recklessly by grifters and paranoics. But beneath the noise is a single truth, cold and unforgiving. Once, at the very height of American power, the most trusted men in uniform sat around a table and plotted how to make their own citizens bleed and die. The plan was stopped, but the door had been opened. And some doors, once opened, never quite close solidly again. Well, another secret operation that horrified folks when they found out about it. I had some interaction with during my military service. It was called Operation Paperclip. That was a plan to slip Nazis into America. They weren't rescued from collapsing German government. They were recruited. War had barely ended in Europe when the Americans arrived, May 1945. And the ruins of Germany still smoldered. Cities collapsed into skeletons of stone, and bridges snapped like matchsticks. Train tracks twisted like nerves. Across the countryside, silence reigned where armies had thundered. Third Reich was gone. But even as the swastikas were torn down, something else, something colder, was unfolding in the shadows. In the foothills of Bavaria, a convoy of unmarked military trucks made its way through the narrow switchbacks near Obermeiringen. The wheel of the lead jeep was Colonel Holger Toftoy, U.S. Army Ordnance. He wasn't there to arrest war criminals. He wasn't there to liberate prison camps. He was there to shop. He was a quiet man with a precise mustache and a fondness for efficiency. What he was looking for wasn't found in the gold bars of Nazi vaults or hidden bunkers of SS archives, but in the minds of members of the German military. German minds, rocket scientists, chemists, physicists, men who had powered the Nazi war machine with formulas and fuel. The ones who had built the V-2 rockets that reduced London to rubble. They had the knowledge, and America wanted it. One of the abandoned barracks outside of Nordhausen, the team found Werner von Braun, 33 years old. Tall man, arm wrapped in a sling from a recent car crash. His description of his eyes were cool, intelligent. He surrendered easily, even politely. When asked if he'd be willing to work for the United States, he smiled and said, "We speak the same language." Toftoy nodded. Got all the paperwork he needed. And I might add that quite often, people brought over under Operation Paperclip and given various jobs within the U.S. government, U.S. military, were qualified in name only. in one of the classes I taught at the infantry school. There was a former Romanian, name was Romitan. He'd been a medic in the German army. He'd been in the Romanian Iron Guard, and a lot of those were seconded into the German military. And when he was captured, he was taken, because of his medical background, he was taken to a camp where they were holding German senior officers. And because of his background and dealing with the Russians, he was recruited. And when he got here, he was asked, "What did you want to do?" "I want to be a doctor." Was he qualified? Well, later events would show he wasn't. But the blessing of the chief of military medicine, he became a doctor for U.S. soldiers. His specialty was eye, ears, nose, and throat. And he was so incompetent, he even killed a kid during surgery, cut the carotid artery from the inside, which is very difficult to do, I'm told. So they put him to doing physicals, and he couldn't even do those correctly. But he was protected till the day he died by the U.S. military. Now, at the time Operation Paperclip got underway, the Soviets were moving west at the same time, seizing towns and dismantling factories, interrogating scientists. The Cold War hadn't begun yet, not officially, but everybody in the intelligence community could already feel it in the air. The alliance was dead before the ink dried, and Germany, broken and gutted, was now the battleground of a different kind. It wasn't about territory anymore. It wasn't about weapons, it was about brains. And inside the U.S. zone, the directive was clear. Find the talent. Get them out. Don't ask too many questions. The men they gathered weren't just scientists. A lot of them were full members of the Nazi Party. Some even had SS rank. Others had designed the very rockets used to terrorize civilians. Names are written in documents retrieved from Peenemünde, Dora Mittelbau, and Anunnaki archives. With the stroke of a pen, though, those records vanished. Operation was called Overcast at first. Later it was renamed to Paperclip. The name came from the paper clips attached to the select personnel files, those chosen to be clean before being shown to the immigration authorities. Those marked with the paper clips would have every reference to Nazism deleted or softened. Scientists to be rebranded not as former enemies, but as assets, technical experts helping the free world stand up against communism. And in Washington, as you might suspect, debate was minimal. Few State Department lawyers balked, of course. One Army investigator reported that von Braun's team had used slave labor at the metalwork factory, where prisoners from Buchenwald died by the thousands, crushed under collapsing tunnels or executed when too weak to work. Well, the War Department had the same answer to all these concerns. It isn't a matter of justice, it's a matter of national security. So planes full of former Nazis began to arrive. Dozens of German scientists landed quietly on American soil between 45 and 52. No announcements, no press. They were taken to isolated military bases in Texas, New Mexico, and Alabama. Some were given false identities. Others used their real names, but with carefully curated biographies. And on that note, we come to the end of today's show. We'll be back tomorrow and talk more about secret operations and government cover-ups and other strange off-the-wall topics. Until then, this is Ken Hudnall for the Ken Hudnall Show saying have a truly great evening.